There's a big debate about how much the Senate should have to say or not say. One thing that's clear is you have a say about who gets to be Secretary of State. Let's talk about Mike Pompeo. You oppose his position as Secretary of State. Explain why.
So I oppose Mike Pompeo because of his history of viewing American power abroad through a military lens, not through a diplomatic lens. And I think the chief qualification for a Secretary of State has to be somebody that truly believes in solving problems through non-military mechanisms. And I worry especially about the advice Pompeo will give next to John Bolton, who has an even bigger reputation than Pompeo for advising solving problems abroad through military means. Pompeo is a smart guy. I actually do think that he's serious about restoring the morale of the State Department. There are checks on both sides of the ledger when it comes to the decision that we make, but I really think that you need a Secretary of State who's going to be thinking diplomacy first, not military action first, especially with a president who, may have an itchy trigger finger.
We learned just recently, actually, that the President of the United States has given Mr. Pompeo a very important diplomatic role in going to North Korea to set up this summit. And some people at the White House, and some of your colleagues even, are concerned that maybe if there's difficulty getting Mr. Pompeo confirmed, it may undermine those talks. For example, Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas had this to say: "I would send a very bad sign, and it would set back the preparations and perhaps even the results of that upcoming summit for the Senate Democrats to oppose as a bloc Mike Pompeo's nomination to be Secretary of State." Do you have any hesitation because of his role in the North Korea summit?
Well, that's a ridiculous argument. If the president was worried about the interruption of negotiations because of a nomination proceeding, then he either shouldn't have said Mike Pompeo or shouldn't have nominated him to become Secretary of State. I think there's a real interesting question as to why the director of the CIA, our intelligence gathering agency, is doing the pre-negotiation work for a diplomatic summit. Why isn't that the State Department that is undertaking that work? We have a Deputy Secretary of State who could be doing that, and a number of other high-ranking diplomatic officials. So ultimately, I'm glad that there is some work being done to set up the parameters of this potential meeting between Trump and the North Korean leader, but it's not a reason to vote for Mike Pompeo.
How big of a risk is it that President Trump's summit with Kim Jong-un could end in failure, and what would the fallout of that be?
Well, I'm very worried about this. I think you have to, see the odds as very high that a Trump-Kim summit fails. These are two combustible leaders who have no experience in cutting high-level diplomatic deals. My worry is that the summit goes badly, that one of them walks out, and then President Trump hears next from John Bolton, who tells him that diplomacy has failed and our only option is a military strike, something that something that John Bolton has been advocating for a long time. I think this is a very high-risk meeting, and I hope that the expectations are reasonable for what can be accomplished in this first meeting.
You've also called the strikes on Syria an illegal overreach. Should Congress rescind the authorization for use of military force?
Well, even with the existing authorization of military force, this is an illegal strike. The authorization is relative to military action against al-Qaeda. This was not a military action against al-Qaeda. It was against the Syrian regime. And so I think Congress has to have a broader conversation about what military action we authorize and what we don't. The president is really using an unprecedented scope to try to provide legal authorization for strikes against regimes and organizations that Congress has had no say in. But I also think that it's a counterproductive strike. I think that ultimately it's just going to quicken the pace of Assad's assault on his own people. And while it may make America feel good to have sent a few missiles into Syria, if it ends up in more carnage for civilians rather than less, then it hasn't accomplished its goal.
Senator, there's an important constitutional question about exactly what role the Congress should play in things that look very much like war. At the same time, there's also a very important international law against use of chemical weapons. If not missile strikes, then what?
Right. I think this is a really important question. And I think at the end of this, there has to be a means of holding Assad accountable. That would be through a criminal court that would try him as a war criminal. But you just have to ask yourself, is a one-day surgical military strike accountability? if in the end it doesn't affect his ability to launch future chemical weapons strikes and he remains in power. When the Americans have signaled very clearly that we are not going to remove Assad from power. He is going to win this civil war. And so this surgical strike is frankly another way of communicating to Assad that he will be able to stay in power. And there are still plenty of people with expertise in launching chemical attacks. They will likely do that in the future. I just question whether this surgical strike is accountability. I think you've got to look to other means of accountability. I would suggest the UN criminal process.
Senator, another subject that you're very much involved in is health care provision in the United States. And you have a bill actually pending to extend Medicare to all Americans. The single-payer approach is something that's been talked about a great deal back when President Obama was putting together his program. A lot of Democrats, a lot of policymakers thought that was the way to go. President Obama, my best reporting was, decided politically that was undoable. Was he right or wrong? And if he was right then, what's changed now?
Well, Senator Sanders has the single-payer plan, and I'm not a sponsor of Senator Sanders' plan. Ours is different. What we suggest is putting a Medicare option for individuals and businesses to choose side by side with private insurance. Our idea behind the Choose Medicare Act is to let the market decide whether Medicare, priced to reflect all of its costs, is the better choice, or whether private insurance is the better choice. I frankly think that's the better way to go than a mandatory single-payer healthcare system. I don't know that I have the same calculus that President Obama has, but I certainly understand why he made the decision that he did, and it's the reason that I support this Medicare option plan, not necessarily a mandatory single-payer plan.
You mentioned Senator Sanders' bill out there. There are many from the Democrats right now. Is that because the calculation is bringing back healthcare debate before the midterm elections is a good thing for the Democrats?
Well, I think that most of our effort has to be spent explaining to the American people what Donald Trump is doing to the healthcare system. He is sabotaging the entire healthcare system. He's trying to rip apart these exchanges. But we don't want to make the same mistakes that Republicans made. They criticized the Affordable Care Act for 8 years without offering a single alternative. And so Senator Sanders has an alternative. I have an alternative. Others have presented plans. And I think that that's the responsible way to engage with the American people. We're going to criticize what Trump is doing to the healthcare system, but we should also have ideas out there for what comes next.
Will this be a winning issue in the midterm elections for the Democrats?
Well, healthcare is the number one issue. You know, when I talk to people in Connecticut, they're talking about healthcare costs, and they know what President Trump is doing to destroy the healthcare system. And so Democrats have got to be talking about this issue, but talking about it responsibly, not just criticizing the president, also telling people what we would do instead.